his mentor and political inspiration. This man was a Ugandan called Yoweri Museveni. Some 12 years Kagame Sr., a political activist and already a determined opponent of the way the authorities were running his country, Yoweri Museveni came from the Hima ethnic group which was closely related to the Tutsis. Museveni was aware of the general plight of the Rwandan refugees and he knew that they perceived themselves as perennial outcasts. He also knew that their youngsters such as Paul Kagame would have little to lose in joining a rebellion promising to topple first the Ugandan government of Idi Amin and then later that of Milton Obote. Among Museveni's early recruits was Fred Ruguyema, Paul Kagame's childhood friend who trained with Museveni in Tanzania and Mozambique. Fred Ruguyema would become a much celebrated and decorated fighter and would eventually become a major general and deputy commander of the Ugandan National Army. In 1978, Fred Ruguyema returned to Western Uganda and reunited with his friend Paul Kagame. Ruguyema then returned to Tanzania and fought in the 1979 war, during which Museveni's rebel group Fronasa, allied with the Tanzanian army and other Ugandan exiles, defeated Idi Amin. Inspired by Fred Ruguyema, Paul Kagame and other Rwandan refugees pledged allegiance to Yoweri Museveni, who became a cabinet member in the transitional government of Uganda. Upon joining Museveni's group, Paul Kagame traveled to Tanzania, where the Tanzanian government, which sought to protect the new Ugandan regime, trained him as a spy. Well, as it so happened, Yoweri Museveni became disgruntled with the now President Milton Obote, and in early 1981, his newly formed National Resistance Army, the NRA, made its first military strike against the Ugandan government. Paul Kagame was among this tiny band of 27 NRA guerrillas along with Fred Ruguyema. Very soon Uganda was now engulfed in a gruesome and bloody civil war. For a number of years during the civil war, Paul Kagame served as an intelligence officer in the NRA and his work entailed gathering information in rural areas, a pivotal role in a guerrilla war with a relatively small number of troops. Paul Kagame often received assignments to go off on missions either alone or with one or two other officers to assess potential targets or glean details of enemy strength and military operations. From being a specialist in intelligence matters for 6 years with the NRA, Paul Kagame rose to become head of military intelligence in Museveni's army following Milton Obote's overthrow in 1986. Paul Kagame and Fred Ruguyema's military and political experiences in the NRA and its political wing, the National Resistance Movement, cannot be underestimated. They and other Rwandan exiles who had fought for Yoweri Museveni began to ask that if the NRA could liberate Uganda, then why could the Rwandan exiles not do the same in Rwanda? This is why in 1987 they formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, which was born out of the Rwandese Refugees Welfare Foundation and the Rwandese Alliance for National Unity. Fred Ruguyema became president of the RPF with Paul Kagame as one of its core leaders. The two men, Ruguyema and Kagame, had complementary traits. Paul was known for his seriousness and it is reported that even adults would go quiet when he entered the room. On the contrary, Fred Ruguyema was charismatic and was liked by many. Fred was known as a consensus builder, while Kagame was meticulously ruthless. It is these qualities that catapulted Ruguyema to the leadership of the RPF. Meanwhile, despite Kagame and Ruguyema's rise to prominent positions within Uganda's government, Yoweri Museveni knew that prejudice against Rwandan refugees was again growing within Uganda. By late 1989, feeling some strong political pressure, Yoweri Museveni demoted both Kagame and Ruguyema from their posts. In 1990, President Museveni sent Paul Kagame for military training to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas in the United States. It is believed that the assignment was a way to get Kagame out of the country, since Museveni knew that Kagame and Ruguyema were quietly planning a military push into Rwanda that would be launched from inside Uganda. If Kagame was absent, Museveni hoped the plans for an invasion into northern Rwanda by the exiles would be halted. At the same time, by 1990, Rwandan exiles in Uganda felt increasingly unwelcome in that country. With this in mind, the Rwandan exiles continued to organize and arm the RPF. The RPF started campaigning for the repatriation to Rwanda of the refugees and vehemently opposed juvenile Habyarimana's Hutu-dominated one-party state, which was now simultaneously losing support due to corruption, increased repression, and general economic decline. This decline in the economy in Rwanda was mainly because of the sharp drop in international coffee prices, the landlocked country's main export. In August of 1990, after two members of Kigali's elite fled to Kampala, bearing tales of how juvenile Habyarimana's regime was on the verge of collapse, Fred Ruguyema became convinced that the time was right to try and topple it. The RPF saw their chance and made their first attack from Uganda in late 1990, initiating what was to be a 4-year civil war. Unfortunately, this invasion in October was a disaster. Nothing went according to plan. Fred Ruguyema was killed on the second day of this attack, leaving fellow officers shell-shocked and demoralized. Moreover, the invasion drew France and other countries into the equation, and they began fighting on the side of the Rwandan government. On the heels of the RPF's invasion into Rwanda, France, Belgium and Zaire sent troops to aid the Habyarimana regime. By 4 October, France had sent 150 troops. Brussels followed suit with over 400 paratroopers. Mobutu Sese Seko, president of Zaire, sensing an opportunity to gain favor with France and Belgium, also sent several hundred of his top presidential guards to the aid of his longtime friend Juvenal Habyarimana. A few days later, after being deceived by a staged attack on the capital Kigali by the armed forces of Habyarimana and his now interim government, France committed an additional 600 troops. Paris continued its support throughout the war, and in addition to logistical assistance, underwrote and facilitated the purchase of over $10 million worth of military supplies.
We buy them from the contribution given by the Rwandese community internally here and in diaspora. There have been a very large Rwandese community outside Rwanda. We also capture a lot of equipment from the government forces.
I see a lot of South African weaponry.
Yes, you can be sure that one was captured from the Rwandese government because they have been buying lots of arms from South Africa.
As for the RPF, following Fred Ruguyema's death, Paul Kagame quickly returned from the United States and took over as leader of this organization. The RPF and its military wing, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, regrouped under his leadership, and by the end of 1991, Paul Kagame had managed to turn the RPF into a disciplined guerrilla force of about 5,000 men. Kagame's campaign yielded some success, and his forces managed to take control of an increasing swathe of territory against the odds of substantial military backing for Habyarimana's corrupt regime by the French, who sent paratroopers, military advisors, and financial support for a mass inflow of arms. But though capable of staging hit-and-run raids in areas of northern Rwanda, the RPF had gained little popular support. Because of this, Paul Kagame was amenable to approaches from members of what was now Rwanda's coalition government for talks. Intermittent peace talks between the parties involved yielded little success until an agreement between the RPF and the government, signed in August of 1993 at Arusha, Tanzania, called for the creation of a broad-based transition government that would include the RPF. Although outside Rwanda, these concessions generated goodwill and, more importantly, economic aid, inside the country they were greeted with great scorn. Hutu extremists were strongly opposed to that plan. Consequently, the dissemination of their anti-Tutsi agenda, which had already been widely propagated via newspapers and radio stations for a few years, intensified and would later serve to fuel ethnic violence in Rwanda. On the evening of April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Juvenal Habyarimana and Burundian President Cyprien Taryamira was shot down over Kigali. The ensuing plane crash killed everyone on board. Although the identity of the person or group who fired upon the plane has never been conclusively determined, Hutu extremists were originally thought to be responsible. Later, there were allegations that RPF leaders were responsible for the attack. Immediately that night, the organized killing of Tutsi and moderate Hutu, led by Hutu extremists, began. Rwanda's Prime Minister, Madame Agathe, a moderate Hutu, was assassinated the next day, as were 10 Belgian soldiers who were part of a United Nations peacekeeping force already in the country. These soldiers were guarding the Prime Minister. The murder of the Prime Minister was part of a campaign to eliminate moderate Hutu or Tutsi politicians with the goal of creating a political vacuum and thus allowing for the formation of an interim government of Hutu extremists. Immediately, the Speaker of the National Development Council, which was Rwanda's legislative body at the time, Theodore Sindikubabo, became interim president on April 8, and the interim government was inaugurated on April 9, 1994. Kagame's RPF rejected the legitimacy of this